Welcome into Warchant TV. This is Ira Schoffel, managing editor of Warchant.com. And I'm joined today by a familiar face, a great friend of the site and the program, Peter Schoenthal, who's the CEO of Athliance. You guys know him for all of his work in the NIL space. He's one of the most trusted experts in the NIL space, but he's also a really smart mind and a keen observer of college athletics business and the entire landscape. So we're going to talk about some of those topics and the NIL as well. So thanks for joining us, and good to have you again, Peter. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's been a hectic couple of weeks with all that's been going on in the landscape. Name, image, and likeness has done a really good job of really showing everyone, both within college athletics and outside of college athletics, the true business nature of what this is. And so NIL ends up bleeding into other areas such as realignment, politics. And so it's, as you all know, following FSU sports, it's been quite hectic the last couple of weeks, and it's been fun. And we're 16 days away from kicking this thing off in Orlando. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about these subjects, and I'm excited to get going.
And for people that haven't caught our previous videos, and I don't know what's wrong with you if you haven't, you need to go back and watch them on the channel at Warchant TV. But also you can see from the iconic photo of Marvin Jones back there laying out a hurricane. Peter's also an FSU guy, and so he comes at it from that perspective. But yeah, starting off right there, Peter, talking about NIL is kind of a part of why realignment's happening, right? Like we've seen these movements from some of these conferences trying to keep pace with the Big Ten and the SEC. The future of NIL and player compensation, that's all a big part of it, right?
Absolutely. So if you really look at what's been happening in NIL, the thing that everyone is really worried about, concerned about, talking about are these collective deals. Like, what are athletes getting? And let's just be honest about what collective deals are. They are salaries being paid by booster groups who are then trying to justify their value by making them marketing deals and making athletes have to do things for them. We have talked at length on these webinars, podcasts, whatever we want to call them, that revenue sharing is coming, which means salaries. When you look at it from that lens, the school and therefore the conferences will be setting the salary cap and paying those dollars out. If you look at professional sports, our salary caps are defined by dollars coming in, most notably TV contracts, TV dollars, okay? So it is important, and realignment is more important than ever, because if you're left out of these two big conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, you're going to be operating with less money to pay your athletes, which is really going to limit your ability to recruit and bring in talent, which is why we saw Drew Rutherford write that op-ed on Warchant. So the last time we spoke, if you remember, there was no realignment news happening. I blurted out, FSU must get out of the ACC by 2025. And that's because that's when the TV dollars explode. That is what aligns with some of the stuff happening in DC and the legal landscape where athletes will be getting salaries. And sure enough, about a week later, everything did explode. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. But NIL kind of started to lead towards that because it was the first time we got a taste of athletes getting paid and that impacting where they go. Are they happy where they are? Are they going to leave? And let's be honest, when we speak about college sports, we really talk about college football and college basketball, but we're FSU. We talk college football, and talent is the name of the game, and talent acquisition. So it starts there, and that's what we're getting at.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting going to ACC kickoff last month up in North Carolina and just talking to some of the other media. You know, again, we've always kind of been outsiders to some degree because we cover Florida State, and Florida State's not on Tobacco Road, and it doesn't always have the same perspective as the schools up there. But even talking to longtime media people who cover the Carolina schools, if you talk to them privately, they were very concerned about the future, and because they were hearing it from their athletic directors and the different people at their schools that they cover, that if you get to a point where these conferences can now distribute this money, their television money, to the athletes, how can these other conferences compete? How can the ACC schools compete if they can't do that? And that's kind of been in the background. But, I think, from a Florida State standpoint, when we had the interview with Peter Collins, the board chair, and he was very forthright about, we've got to figure out some solutions because this isn't going to work for us. Then the board of trustees met that week and basically said the same thing. And Florida State hasn't left yet. They're still in the ACC. But it feels like that's still the same reality. Like nothing's changed, right?
Nothing has changed, right? And there's so much legalities that go into it, right? FSU will be out of the ACC by 2025. And Gene had a really, really good update. I think it was on the 14th or the 11th, where he was talking about, listen, FSU's probably not going to announce by the deadline, which was August 15th, in order to find a home for 2024. Because the new sentiment is what you mentioned, all of these other athletic directors talking about, well, wait a minute, we got to get out too. Why take on the legal recourse of having to pay back the exit fee? If you think 3, 4, 5, 6 others may leave, which will then dissolve the conference like we saw overnight with the Pac-12. This stuff can happen overnight. And then there's no exit fee to pay, right? And if you look at the TV dollars, they really explode in 2025. Now they're out of whack in 2024 as well, but you can survive 1 year of that, okay? That is why everything is so crucial. That's why the August 15th date didn't mean anything. I think FSU could have been in a position to wait for August 15th to go and then announce August 16th that we have 2 years to figure out where we're going in 2025. And I know we're going to talk about it in a moment, but after the Oregon and Washington move, FSU has never had more leverage than they do right now. And it's a numbers game, it's a region game, and it's going to get real fun. And FSU has the ability to pit ESPN and Fox against each other right now. Because we like to talk about the SEC versus the Big Ten. No. It's Fox versus ESPN. These TV networks control the game. Big Ten is with Fox. SEC is with ESPN. That's what matters most.
You know, what's funny is like coming out of the ACC kickoff again, you know, after some of the comments that were made, well, actually it was after that, a week or so later when the Board of Trustees had their meeting. I had some media friends of mine in the media who cover other schools call and ask how serious Florida State is and all that. And I told them, I think they're very serious. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but you know, it's clear that they want to go. They feel like they have to go. And one of these reporters said that they've got really good sources close to Jim Phillips, the ACC commissioner. And he was very confident at the time that the Big Ten was not going to expand. They're happy at 16, just like the SEC has been saying they're happy at 16. And then all of a sudden they go out and add Oregon and Washington. It's like what these conferences say, and the reason I bring it up is because Greg Sankey has said we're fine at 16 as well. If everything is the same as it is at this particular moment, like they're fine at 16. But if things change, and one of the things that could change and change things dramatically is the makeup of that college football playoff. Because right now, you know, there's a certain amount of automatic qualifiers from the Power 5 conferences. Well, now if the Pac-12 is gone, if that's out of the picture, the SEC and the Big Ten are going to want more at-large bids. And if that happens, it stands to reason they may want more teams to put in the mix. And now, to your point, which you just touched on, if you're looking to expand again, like who would be more attractive than Florida State and Clemson?
Well, let's go a little deeper on a few things, and we might even get to the 64-team league that Chip Kelly brought up, removing football from the NCAA, making its own standalone. I think there's a lot of value in that, and then bringing back the Pac-12 for other sports. I don't want to go down that route too much. I'm old enough to remember when the Pac-10 had 10 schools and was happy enough being a 10-school league. I'm old enough to remember when the Big 8 was the same way. I'm old enough to remember when the Big 10 said we would never expand. We're 10. These conferences will continue to expand if that's what the networks call for and that's what the landscape calls for. I'm gonna give some numbers in a moment. But there's a legal reason why they always have to say that too, which is tampering, right? You don't want to get dragged into a lawsuit. It's also much easier for a school to declare that they're leaving a conference and then broker something. If you have Greg Sankey coming out and saying, yeah, we want to keep expanding, we want to keep bringing in schools, and then there's all this rumors that FSU's talking with you, and then they announced they're leaving the ACC, and then 10 hours later or 1 hour later or simultaneously announced they're going to the SEC, it's just not worth the legal recourse. You're better off just saying we're not interested until we're interested, right? That's the old coaching thing. I'm happy where I am. I have no intention of leaving this school. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, my agent was talking to the school. I didn't know. And they brought me this offer. What was it? You have to say what you have to say. But I think the numbers are more important. And I mentioned earlier that FSU and Clemson have more leverage than they've ever had before. All right, so let's look at the landscape. The SEC is in bed with ESPN, which means ESPN controls the Southeast as it pertains to football. And that is the market you want to be in. All right. Fox is with the Big Ten. They are dominant everywhere but in the Southeast. And the Big Ten, by Fox, Fox wants to be in the Southeast because if they do, they cover the whole country. It's a big power play for them. Well, guess what 2 schools are still left on the table that have big brands that allow them into the Southeast? Florida State and Clemson. All right. But look at the numbers. Big Ten has 18 schools, right? They just got Washington. They just got Oregon. The SEC has 16. If the Big Ten were to add Florida State and Clemson, it's now 20 versus 16. And all of the big brand football teams and schools are off the board. I actually think ESPN and the SEC are in a crucial spot to continue to control college athletics via the Southeast, via football, therefore keeping Clemson and Florida State. They just have to tippy toe and figure out a way to get it done while understanding that the ACC is also their client. Because if Fox is able to get into the Southeast and they have 20 programs versus 16, you could argue in the coming years that the Big Ten could become the number 1 conference in the country. You know, I think we are creatures of what's happening now. I remember that before really that first urban run at Florida, the SEC wasn't this big dominant conference that won every national championship and dominated the landscape. Right. They created to continue grabbing power with their relationship with ESPN to get the TV dollars in, which made their conference more money, which allowed them to spend more, which allowed them to have a bigger footprint, which allowed them to be more dominant. Don't let Fox do that. And ESPN knows that. And I think that's why Florida State and Clemson have leverage. They know that they're the gatekeeper of the Southeast for the Big Ten and Fox. And they know they're the last big brands on the table for the SEC. That's why I think you're seeing FSU be vocal. Push the envelope. Let's get a home. And when you're vocal, the media gets involved. You're pitting these two networks against each other. And when you pit people against each other, it creates leverage. Like the last thing you want is FSU coming into the Big Ten or the SEC and getting only a fraction of the revenue. Now you have a play. And so I think that's why you're seeing vocalization. I think that's why FSU is in a very strong spot, even without announcing before August 15th.
Yeah, the only thing, and I'm with you 100%. I think that what's different now compared to 10 years ago was at that point, the SEC wasn't concerned about the Big Ten trying to come into the Southeast. And so if Florida and South Carolina didn't want Florida State and Clemson in, and Florida State and Clemson didn't really add a whole lot at that point in time, there was no playoff. They already had the cable TVs in these markets. There really wasn't an incentive, but it's totally different now because A, the Big Ten clearly is in expansion mode, and B, it's not always necessarily going to be about television sets anymore. It is about brands, and it is about college football playoff appearances. If you've got more schools that can make the playoff, you may become the conference that makes the most money, especially if they open it up and there's more at large teams. So I think the landscape, you hear a lot of the arguments that were made 10 years ago. People are still making them. Oh, well, Florida doesn't want Florida State in the SEC. Well, I don't think that matters anymore. Texas A&M did not want Texas in the SEC.
Boom. That's the main one, right? I also think some luck has happened Florida State finally after dealing with some really unlucky stuff the last couple of years. And that's the change of what's happened in the landscape. One, FSU gets Mike Alford, who is more business focused, and brings in Peter Collins to run the trustees, more business focused. We're focused more on the dollars rather than fit and the way things work, right? Those days are over. We saw a 100-year conference, the Pac-12, disappear overnight. That's one. I will also argue what helped FSU tremendously is it's not so much now about getting only into a market, but viewership. Streaming has changed everything. And when that happened, and the University of Miami no longer became this large program, it really made Florida State the last big piece on the puzzle where you can get into a regional market while also getting the stream and eyes. I'm sure you guys will run the graphics while I'm speaking. Medium.com, who basically tracks viewership, tracked the most watched college football programs in 2022. I believe Florida State was in 13 or 14. UF was like 13, 14, 15. We're both right there. The University of Miami was either 59 or 61. So Miami could have been one of those brands that also allowed one of these networks to really want to get in and pit that against Florida State from leverage. You can't do that anymore. No one's watching them. They're not producing on the field as much, and that really helped Florida State. Now, I will say, if Florida State goes to the SEC, the Big Ten will probably make a play for them. But if Florida State goes to the Big Ten, I don't know what Miami's going to do. That feels like Big 12 country for me, and they'll be playing for the trophy, the Turnpike Trophy, with UCF as their new rival, which would be funny. But these are all things to monitor. So FSU had a few good breaks, which was who they brought in to run the athletic department in the university, the way streaming took over just regular old cable television, okay, what happened with Miami, and then also Florida State and Clemson being the last power names in football being left on the board. It just created a really good storm for Florida State right now.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. And I think you see that the difference, everything's crystallized now when you have leadership at Florida State who is of that mindset, when the ACC's mindset is the way it has always been. And I remember sitting, Dr. Eric Barron, FSU's president, several years ago, back when this was going on 10 years ago, and he talked off and on the record. It wasn't just on the record, even off the record. He felt like academics was a big part. Regionality was a big part. All the fit and all those things about conference alignment. And you see the movements now, the Big Ten going out and getting Southern Cal and UCLA. You look at the SEC going to get Texas and Oklahoma. You look at these other schools that are, and Peter Collins said it in the interview we had, it's geography matters to some degree, but really finances what drives everything. What I think is interesting about that is I was listening to an interview with Brett Yormark, who's the Big 12 commissioner, and he said one of the reasons he went to the Big 12 and took that job, he had a great job. The reason he took that job was because he had talked to the board of the Big 12, the schools that were still there, that people had written off as cast-offs, and that was the conference everybody thought was going to die. He said, what I loved about talking to their board of presidents was they want to focus on business. They want to increase revenue. They want to look to the future. They don't want to just operate the way college athletics has always operated, but it feels like the ACC is still operating under the old method, and it feels like that's why they're going to be extinct. And the only reason what I want to get to with all that is there is a little bit of concern. You've heard some pundits talking about, will the media rights bubble ever burst? Is what's happening now really going to continue to escalate 10 years from now, 15 years from now, with cord cutting and all that? Is that going to change the landscape? Do you have any concern about that part of it, just the future of college athletics, the money that's coming in? And if we're going to make decisions based on business, what if the market doesn't keep growing? And how do you see that playing out?
All right, so a few things on that. One, when we talk about the ACC not kind of conforming, the Big 12 and the Pac-12 have been in competition the last couple of years, let's be honest. One conformed, one didn't. One's thriving, one disappeared overnight. So that's on the ACC, all right? When it comes to streaming rights and cord cutting, if you look at the history of television, whether it was network television or what we're seeing now, there have been ups and downs, decline. The one steady riser is live sports. There will always be a need for it. There will always be consumption for it. And so I don't necessarily see there being a decline. There might be a leveling off, but I don't worry about the finances. It just might not continue to rise at the astronomical rate we are seeing. But at the end of the day, people aren't going to stop watching college football, right? It's just gotten so professionalized with the amount of dollars that have come in recently because people started to realize the value of those sports, of that sport and the viewership with it. It's why the NCAA, who I'm more supportive of than others because I work in college athletics now, so I see it as more than just football. I mean, the NCAA has to deal with 3 divisions, 1,200 schools, and like 30 sports, right? I do believe that football has just gotten too big, too powerful, too much money, where they can operate under the NCAA umbrella, but they need their own rules, their own government. There could be a scenario where we just eliminate conferences for football and just have it for the other sports. Like, I agree with a lot of people. It makes no sense for volleyball players at Oregon to have to go take a red eye and go play at Rutgers and come back the next night if we're calling them student athletes. And let's be honest, they are student athletes. So it's hard to talk about college athletics and football under the same umbrella. They've gone in different directions financially. And listen, dollars matter. The TV dollars and the dollars that football bring in don't just impact football. They impact the other sports in a positive way. They impact university from enrollment and applications and donor dollars, right? So it's not a bad thing that we're getting all this additional money to come in because of college football. The one thing we're all waiting for is the athletes to get a piece of the pie. But I'm not worried about there being this big crash. There might just be a leveling out. And we've seen that, though, over time. There's been other realignment where it happens quick. It's a mad dash, and then it evens out for 5-10 years, and then it happens again. Right. We'll see that. I don't know what the next iteration is, but again, I mean, does anyone remember the Southwest Conference? Right, that became a big eight. Right? The realignment's been happening for a long time. It shocks the nerve, and what people didn't see coming was the evaporation of some of the Power Fives. Like the ACC could happen, and what happened to the Pac-12. I mean, I can't say it enough. 100-year conference, which was one of the strongest in the country for 100 years, disappeared overnight.
I mean, think about, when they started the college football playoff, there was so much wrangling because they didn't want to mess with the Rose Bowl. Like the Rose Bowl was so important because of the Pac-12 and Big Ten's history that like they had to change. They just had to dance around that so much because it was so important. And here we are now, and that conference is basically gone. They're still trying to. They haven't conceded completely. We'll see. By the time this runs, we'll see maybe Stanford and Cal have been gobbled up by the ACC or not. But as we're recording this, that hasn't happened yet. Although it still seems to be on the table. You brought up the NCAA.
The one wrench for Florida State, which could be a positive, is if all hell breaks loose and we don't end up somewhere in 2025. I think there's so many other opportunities to make additional revenue, sign individually. I could see it being worth going back independent. I would rather be an independent as Florida State than be in the ACC. Why share all these dollars with all these other schools? I'd rather be on my own. I'm sure we're going to talk at the end on some of the things we've heard with JB Morgan and financing the exit fee. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm in startup life, right? And I understand that world as well. But if we don't end up in the Big Ten or the SEC, which I think is 99.9% going to happen, one or the other, I think the other thing that I was talking about is, so one of these schools one day, if they can't get in, they're not happy where they are going to go back to being an independent like Notre Dame is. And I think that could get interesting as well.
Yeah, and you know what? Actually, and a lot of times we've kind of written that off when people have brought that up. But I actually had someone bring up the hypothesis to me. What if Florida State, if they can't get out of the grant of rights, and again, there seems to be confidence that they can, but the grant of rights is their home game television revenue. But like somebody brought up to me the idea, what if Florida State wanted to just play in their non-home games, their other half of their schedule, play high-profile big matchups against other schools that would do separate like neutral site games, and ESPN wouldn't own that inventory. Those would be neutral site games negotiated differently. I don't know that makes up the difference, but there are options, I think, to your point.
Worst case scenario, you'll be making the same money you were making in the ACC because you're making more money and you got to share some of that revenue while you keep your options open. So one of these schools might eventually do it. I think it's I'll put it as option C, but it's a 0.1% chance. When Ross Perot used to run for president, right? We still have our two candidates.
You made a comment about the NCAA, so I'm going to jump there real quick. The decision to, and again, there's some semantics about whether or not the one-time transfer rule and two-time transfer rule, and it's kind of gone back and forth. There was really a strong movement for empowerment of players to be able to have free movement. There was actually the NCAA considered about a year ago the idea that players could transfer every year and there'd be no limits. Every year you could transfer to a new school. And there were a lot of people thought that was going to get approved. It did not get approved. And then then the next part of it, they've decided to be more stringent about the rules that were already in place about when you could transfer a second time while you're still an undergraduate. Darrell Jackson of Florida State is one of the high-profile cases. There's a couple others as well, the receiver at North Carolina, and a few others as well. First of all, real quick on that, are you surprised they didn't just grandfather in this year's kids? Because up until this year, they were pretty wide open with the waivers. Like they had gone so far the other way to then switch midfield seems kind of
Yeah.
the word tone deaf has been used a lot by the politicians, and now you've got these politicians who are trying to get involved, and that's the next step of it. I want to talk to you about why you think, because you and I talked off the air, you feel like those guys, the juice that the political side may have, may actually affect this situation.
I'm a little torn on it because without getting into some of the things I know, I think a lot of people are opining on Daryl Jackson's situation without knowing all the facts and what was actually presented to the NCAA and understanding why they made that denial, which based on what I know, I get they probably should have, under the new rules, denied it. And they're not really new rules. It was just an announcement they're going to be more stringent on it. And I think some of the actions of Daryl Jackson after January 11th played a large part in that denial, without getting into a lot of those facts. But this goes back more towards the NCAA is in a tough spot where most people were like, the transfer portal is out of control. We need some limits on it. So they're like, all right, we'll strengthen it, but we'll do it in a way where you get a free transfer and you can get as many transfers as you want after that if you fall under these prongs, like your coach leaves or, a real family issue to get home to, which is your number one priority and all those things. But what they should have realized is that they don't really have a good public perception right now. And if someone does put in a waiver before the new, right, they're not new rules, the way we're going to enforce those rules are, right, you probably should have. But then they're in a tough spot because there were things that happened after January 11th that further showed that maybe that waiver shouldn't have been granted. And so I actually kind of understand what the NCAA did, but this is what happens when you're the boy who cried wolf, right? You do a bunch of bad stuff for 115 years and you're the bad guy for 115 years. When it comes to football, they do a lot of good stuff with other stuff. You're not going to get the benefit of the doubt. And then the politicians got involved, which I know we're about to talk about.
But also it's like you went so far the other way. It's felt like they were about a hair away from allowing free transfers every year to now like, oh no, we're not going to do that. And we're going to go back much harsher with our enforcement. Because again, I whether or not the Daryl Jackson case, we don't need to litigate that because there are other cases as well. But there are players around the country who've been to 3 or 4 schools as undergraduates and seem to always kind of get the pass. So that's from a PR standpoint. I guess that's the point. And now,
well, let's look at normal laws, right? When a new bill is introduced in the state of Florida, 99.9% of the time, there's an effective date and it's set out so people can adjust, right? Or it's like at the time of. It's never retroactive,
right?
So that I get that. Now there were actions taken after January 9th that I think came on the NCAA's radar that were like, come on. But if I were them, I would have started this on their calendar year, which was August 1st. And so I do agree with that, especially when you have a public perception problem. Like, right, we talked about this at length. There is right and wrong, and there is also getting the benefit of the doubt. The NCAA has to start doing things where they can get a little bit more benefit of the doubt with public perception, and they're just not doing it. And someone tweeted today that they need a vice president of common sense. That I agree with when it comes to football.
So, as we've seen now, Marco Rubio was the first politician to get involved, senator from Florida. Then Jimmy Patronis, the CFO of Florida, he wrote a letter to the NCAA. Now, earlier this week, there was a huge, 12 congressmen from the state of Florida sent a letter also asking the NCAA to revisit this issue. And, they're writing about Daryl Jackson because he's our constituent. He's in the state of Florida. A lot of, at first I kind of, just kind of like shrugged at that. But, you and I talked about it a little bit, and you brought up a good point that, Congress, the NCAA is looking to the Congress for help in one matter. So maybe Congress might be listening a little bit more to this, or the NCAA might be listening a little bit more to what Congress has to say about this matter. Maybe if you want to flesh that out a little bit.
So when the waiver was denied, you reached out to me because you know that I work with, I speak with NCAA and enforcement. You said, any chance that this gets overturned? And I said, no, I didn't see it. And then all these letters started coming in. First Marco Rubio, and I said, it's one. Then Jimmy Patronis said, he works with the state, right? He's, I think, the CFO of the state of Florida, right?
Right.
But when you started getting bipartisan House of Representatives on both Republicans and Democrats, and 12 of them petitioning the NCAA. Then I reached out and I said, okay, for the first time, I think something could happen. The NCAA, when it comes to NIL, doesn't necessarily need Congress. We've gone over that at length. They're using that as a lobby play. But at some point in the next 2 or 3 years, they are 100% going to need Congress to help them on the employment fight, or they're in big trouble. And you are currently lobbying Congress about, we need your help. We're not the bad guys. We're the good. We want to save college athletics, something we all love.
And point out real quick, every time they've gone before Congress in any kind of hearing so far, Congress has killed them. Right. So it's not like they're starting at ground zero. Like, they've got to work their way back to ground zero to have any luck of it.
Except for in the NIL committee, they actually did pretty good. Their constituents on there, like athletic directors, right, stuff like that, they did good there. But if you need someone to help you out, the last thing you want to do is piss them off or say no to them when they need a favor as well. And so if this were Mark Emmert, I think Mark didn't care. And he'd be like, nope, we're the NCAA. But Charlie Baker's a lobbyist. Charlie Baker's a politician. Yeah. And when you're a politician, sometimes you got to trade things you don't want to trade to get the overall thing you need to get done. And so when I saw those 12 for the first time, I think you might see some action. And all the NCAA has to do is say, listen, we met with Congress. They pointed out to us that there's a little bit of retroactivity here. So what we're doing is any waiver that was requested before January 11th, i.e. January 9th for Daryl Jackson, we're going to go revisit that and we'll approve those under the old guidelines. You can save face and do it. But if you say no, you're setting a precedent of like, we want you to help us out, but we're not willing to help you out. Right. And that is not the way to get things done in Congress, right? We see it all the time. That's not how bills are made, right? So very interesting. And so for the first time, I think there's a possibility you see Daryl Jackson play this year.
Yeah, from a football perspective, I'll just tell people, again, we're not trying to build up your hopes,
no,
Florida State fans. But if it were to happen, just so you understand, if you're not reading the daily practice reports, Daryl Jackson is practicing every day as if he's going to play. So, and I'm sure the receiver at North Carolina, and I'm sure any other guys who may fall in that category would probably be the same situation. So the good thing about it is, if those guys are cleared, it would be pretty seamless. Like, they're still practicing. It wouldn't be like, okay, now they got a call 2 days before the season opener, and now they've got to go through their own preseason camp. No, they've been practicing. They're ready to go. It's just a matter of whether or not they get the green light. So we'll have to see how that goes. But I thought that was really insightful. I appreciate you talking about that.
If the NCAA does this and lets Daryl play in the North Carolina play, and you get in good graces with some of these House of Representatives, I'd actually argue that it also strengthens their ability to get some things done down the road. I just think it's a trade-off that's worth it for the NCAA. And I'm not even saying that as a Florida State fan, because my opinion on the Daryl Jackson waiver and some of the things that I know behind the scenes. I don't think it's a strong candidate, but now I do, and I'm not going to complain. You see the hats in the background and the picture. I'm not going to complain.
So, and then going back to, I guess maybe we can kind of wrap up here, looking at Florida State's future, and you touched on it earlier, with the report came out about Florida State looking at maybe a private equity and just trying to figure out the finances for the future for the program. And I don't know that, and I've been telling people for 6 months, I don't think Florida State wants to pay you see these numbers floated out there, $500 million for the grant of rights and $120 million for the exit fee and all. They don't want to pay any of that.
No.
So I don't necessarily believe that this is a deal where they're trying to get that money to set aside because they want to, because if they were fine just paying that off and leaving, they could have already done that. But it would be better if it didn't happen that way. But it opens up a lot of opportunities, right? Like, and one of the things, you've again, looking at college sports, but from more of a business standpoint, this concept of maybe getting some of the private equity money or other outlets involved in college athletics. Like, how do you see that? And where do you think Florida State's kind of mindset's at?
Yeah, I think it depends on how much will be owed if we have to, let's say the ACC doesn't dissolve and we're on the hook for some dollars, right? I think some of that depends. A lot of this is dependent on what's going to be owed.
How that plays out, sure.
Is it just the 120 or you have to factor in the other 500? I mean, those all matter. But I mentioned earlier, you had asked me about these TV dollars, right? And whether or not we're going to see a decline. And I said, no, I think it's going to continue to go up or level out. And that's because if you look at the one area of America on what's recession proof, what's depression proof, what's economically solid, it's sports. It's live sports. And college football fits into that, specifically college football in the Southeast. So it's a safe bet. When I saw JP Morgan getting involved, I didn't think it was an equity play. And I could be wrong. I think it's more FSU realizes that, and JP Morgan recognizes that it might be smarter for FSU to take out a loan, okay, with certain payback provisions. Like, let's just do math here. All right. Let's say it cost $150 million for us to get out. That's a big undertaking in one big, check. That kills us. But a lot of these funds, like JP Morgan, these big banks and institutions, that's nothing to them. So if you get a $150 million loan to get out, right, and then it's another $50 million payback, right, that's $200 million. That's a lot for FSU. But if you know this is recession proof and you know that the money's coming, for an institution like that, $10 million over 20-year payback, as an institution, you just made $50 million. And as FSU, you are able to pay back $10 million a year and operate the way you need to operate while being in the SEC and Big Ten. It doesn't hurt you. That's what I think might be happening more. They're looking into, all right, if we get out, what's it really going to cost? And is there basically a mortgage we can take out, right? And it works for both sides. I think there's other things going on, like stadium renos and other aspects. I don't know if this is necessarily about getting out of the grant of rights and the exit fee. I don't know if public institutions want to be in bed with private equity from a rev sharing standpoint from that investment. Right. I think the loan makes more sense. And it really works for everyone. I think that's a really viable option. Add 50 million VIG, $200 million, $10 million a year for 20, everyone wins.
Yeah, and a couple of things on that, just to kind of follow up on what you're saying. One is Florida State, because you have these exit fees and grant of rights, that's all out there. But also at the same time, Florida State is renovating Doak Campbell Stadium, which is going to be a huge project. Probably, I'm not sure the total amount, but it may be a couple $100 million. They're planning to offset that with revenue that comes in through selling these new skyboxes and chairback seats and all the different venue opportunities, loge boxes, and all this ways to generate more revenue. But it's still a big undertaking. And then also the new football standalone facility is going to be well over $100 million, I believe, when it's all done. They've already begun work on that. They're going to really go construction heavy into that at the end of the season as well. So those two projects are out there. Plus, there's a lot of people who would like to see Florida State either renovate or rebuild Dick Howser Stadium, the baseball. I mean, there's a lot of Florida State wants to be with the big boys in college athletics. They want to invest. That's part of the reason they want to be in the SEC or the Big Ten or something like that, to bring in that kind of money. And all of that takes money. So they're probably going to need some upfront money. So I think to your point on that. And the last thing I wanted to say, and just kind of following up on your point about why sports, and I want to echo what you said about why live sports does so well. It's because, and we all know how people watch television now with binging. If it's not live sports, pretty much anything else you can kind of scan through the commercials. You don't have to watch the commercials. And with the reason the NFL is able to charge, I mean, it's the number one sport in the world, but it's also because people have to watch. They have to watch the commercials. Yep. And college football is kind of becoming the next thing. So I'm with you. No matter what happens, I'm not as concerned about the future of college football. There may not be 100 schools in the mix that believe they can win a national title. Maybe it's down to 40 or maybe it's down to 50, but those are the schools that move the needle anyway.
I got a secret for you, but just for you and I, not the listeners. That's already the case. You know what I mean? So like it's not that big of a deal. Like, let's be honest. If we didn't have sports, why would I still have cable? Why would I have YouTube TV, right? It's the only thing keeping them alive, which means that's why the networks are big on this regardless. And there are some things that don't change, and sports in America being recession-proof is one of them, in my opinion.
Well, that's all for me, Pete. Anything else? Anything we need to keep an eye on? You've been NIL Stradamus in the past. We may need to expand that from the NIL space. Anything else kind of in the horizon you think we need to be looking out for before we bring you back on to talk again?
Yeah, I think once the season starts, that's when sometimes a lot of the movement happens behind closed doors, because now all the eyes are off you. They're on the game. If you look at when a lot of these schools announce they're leaving, it's usually during some form of season. My prediction is by January 1st of 2024, FSU will have announced that they are leaving the ACC. I'm not sure they'll have a home by then, but one way or another, they'll be out there. And I believe we get our first big NIL infraction, one way or another, by November 1st.
And you're talking about nationally.
Yeah.
First big national.
Yeah, not Florida State. Florida State's fine.
Right. Good stuff, man. Well, I appreciate it. And people that you want to follow you on Twitter, why don't you give out your social real quick?
Yeah. At NIL Pete on Twitter. My Instagram's not worth it. Just follow me on Twitter at NIL Pete. I'll be taking some shots at some Hurricanes and Gators during the season. I usually pick it up a little bit during the season, but I'm just excited. We're 16 days away. I'm really excited about this team. It's nice to be excited about a Florida State football team.
Yeah, there's no doubt, man. It's going to be a lot of fun, and Florida State's well positioned for this time. In this time, day and time, I think they've done it. It's been intentional. They did a good job of really reinvesting in athletics. This football program to be in position for whatever is possible to be as possible.
People underestimate that, right? Yeah. The way Miami's gone in the last 20 years and how we're trending back up, Miami's not being talked about with this realignment like we are. The best example is UCF and USF. Before UCF started taking off, USF was UCF. They were number 2 in the country. Mm-hmm. They were doing great. Then all of a sudden they go downhill and UCF goes uphill. Now all of a sudden, look what's happening in the shift. UCF is in the Big 12. The USF doesn't know what they're going to do, and it could change the trajectory of their programs forever. Right. We talked about luck. That's happened to Florida State. We're getting better at the right time. Miami's not, and we could be the ones that deal with the spoils because of it. So I think that's important, and you bringing up that we're kind of back up on that track at the right time really does matter.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Pete. Thanks, everybody, for watching it. And stay tuned, subscribe, and like the video. And check out warchant.com for more coverage. And Pete is on warchant.com as well. So if you sometimes you'll see him on the message boards. If you have questions, you can actually tag him on the message boards. And NIL Pete, and he'll give you some great insight. So thanks again, Pete. We'll talk to you soon.